We are now moving forward, and give the floor now to the expert in publishing ethics, PhD in philosophy, member of the Elsevier company, Michael Grecea. Please, the floor is yours.
Could you please confirm that you can hear me and see me well?
Да, мы вас видим и слышим. Все.
Yes, we do hear and see you very well. Thank you.
Well,
We see your slides.
thank you for confirmation. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me for this conference. So for me, it's actually a second time meeting people at this conference, this time only online. 2 years ago, I just visited Moscow for the first time, and I still have very nice memories from there. Let's put a little bit in context and also briefly explain my role at Elsevier. So you very likely have heard of Elsevier. We are quite big, actually. We publish around 2,700 journals. Not all of them are owned by Elsevier. Around 600 journals are owned by societies of various fields, but we publish also those journals. Nowadays, we publish around 600,000 new papers per year. And of course, hasn't been always like this, but since almost dating back almost 200 years ago, we have around 16 million articles and chapters on Science Direct. We could say our weakest point around the various subject areas are the humanities and the social sciences, and the strongest area from our perspective is the science, technology, and medical journals. In order to achieve this, our journals receive 2.5 million submissions every year. Around 8,000 editors-in-chief work closely with around 250 publishers, internal people. Well, as you can imagine, given the very large number of submissions at our journals, even the 1% of the papers seems to bear some ethics issues, that would be quite a lot for the editors and for the people dealing with ethics at Elsevier. My role there, it's officially called expert in publishing ethics. So I handle, I'm one of the teams, one of the members of the ethics team, and I handle a large number of complex ethics cases, usually ethics cases that involves more than one journal, that involves a large number of papers, and rarely that involves some of our editors, but generally cases with potential PR impact. What I'm going to talk about today is I'll start with Elsevier's perspectives on the responsibilities of the publisher. Then I'll go quickly through the various definitions, let's say, of research integrity and publishing ethics. I would highlight what Elsevier has been active in educating and preventing ethics issues, as well as what initiatives and tools we developed to detect the ethics issues. Well, we not always manage to educate, prevent, and detect. So we also receive a large number of complaints regarding papers after the publication. So I will talk a bit about the investigation and the resolution. And I plan to end with a couple of slides about the reproducibility, the data reproducibility, and of course will be time for questions and comments. Well, at Elsevier, we do not make a difference, let's say, where we believe there is a little difference between the research integrity and the publishing ethics. Actually, anything that happens in the research process to a large extent will hit eventually will hit the journal. will influence any paper that actually comes out from the research. So it's very likely, we believe, that an issue of research integrity will affect the journals and the publishers. So it's one aspect that we consider actually fundamental in what we are doing regarding ethics at Elsevier. For certain countries, I'm located in the Netherlands. I'm sure for and if I just think of the what Sonia presented about various actions and activities in Sweden, I'm sure there are countries that some of the instructions that we offer, we make available, honestly speaking, are a bit boring. Some of them are the things that we write there are quite obvious for people. But I have to say that there are also many areas in the world where perhaps the institutions or the institutions have a less mature research culture and a less collective memory acknowledge and knowledge. So we very often give, together with the editors and my colleagues, give workshops until 2020, many of them in person, but recently online. And we noticed what we call a real thirst for knowledge, in particular from the young people, from the young researchers, because there are a lot of gray areas. You may think the perceptions may be that, you know, should be kind of straightforward. It's either wrong or right, but there are many gray areas that requires education and training. One of the key aspects we have been active on is to provide the editors of our journals with all the resources that they need to prevent and to investigate the ethics issues. Personally, I've been working in the last 7 years with many editors on handling, let's say, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 ethics cases. And I would say, without exaggerating, that I don't recall 2 cases that would look exactly the same. So it is a lot of complexity involved there, and there are, again, a lot of gray areas. So we do the best to provide the editors with all the resources that they need. Well, sometimes the editors have to make, the editors of the journals have to make rather unpopular decisions. Let's say either retracting or in some cases not retracting a paper could be equally unpopular among the parties involved there, either the complainant or the authors of the paper. Well, in some cases, the editor or their decision is strongly challenged and can become extremely unpleasant. Well, in some cases, the editors are threatened. Sometimes they are mentioned by social media, not in a very nice way. There have been few cases when editors receive threatening to their personal home address. So it's important for Elsevier to let them know, to make sure that the editors know that we stand by for them, and sometimes even with legal or other means support. Well, thankfully, this happens rather rarely, but it does happen. Well, the reason that fundamentally we find the research integrity so important in a sense, it boils down to a question of trust. You can talk about trust at the various levels. Let's say at the basic level, the reader needs to know, can I trust this paper? But on this, it builds up the next level and the next one. Can I trust this research group? Can I trust this institute? And even, questions like, can I trust research or results coming from this country? So when you get a really fundamental level, there is also an issue of the public trust in science. If for a society, the question, can I trust in science, appears very often or more and more often, it must be a serious problem for that society. And excuse me, this was quite obvious in the last 1.5 years. There are questions like, can I trust the vaccine? Can I trust the research that advise to wear masks in the public places? So this element of trust at various levels, it's fundamental for when we think at what we are doing at regarding ethics and research integrity at Elsevier. But this slide shows the results on some survey, and I would say at the first sight it's slightly frightening. So a rather large percentage of people that apparently researchers do not trust the research outputs. On the other hand, I would say it's a kind of standard element of a researcher to doubt on everything that she reads or see. So personally, I would find it rather healthy and normally, not just because something is published somewhere to immediately trust it. So I find this as a rather healthy and a normal level of skepticism. Well, I won't go into much detail about the various definition of research integrity. It can be taken in a different ways. For example, the research integrity can be seen, can be viewed as absence of misconduct, for example, or it can take it in a much wider way to include questionable research practice, or to include lack of the reproducibility. But personally, what I would insist of it's to not attach a stigma. For example, I've seen many cases when somebody tried to reproduce the results found in a paper, and for some reason they're not able to reproduce the results, and automatically the accusation that the authors of the first paper being or misbehaving appeared. So we need to be careful with accusing people and attaching stigma. So the data falsification, the data fabrication, plagiarism, it's a kind of classical definition that, as far as I'm aware of, came from the National Institute of Health. Personally, I would be inclined to include the peer review manipulation in this category of so-called the most serious types of ethics misbehavior. And fairly often, one of these types of ethics misbehavior would lead to a retraction of the paper of papers. But you know, I would like to add here that most of the researchers, most of people behave properly. There are only some researchers that cheat a little on purpose, but many do it unintentional. Sonia was talking about intentional and non-intentional plagiarism as well, because eventually scientists are human as well, and science, it's extremely hard to do it perfectly. Interesting to know that behavioral economics shows that we as persons are far less objective than we think, and far more prone to the confirmation bias. And scientists are, of course, not exempt. I would mention here actually the patient that drives them, the scientist, to persist and pursue their theory despite setbacks, and this may cause them to be biased. Well, regarding the education and prevention, as I mentioned earlier, with organized hundreds, maybe thousands now in the full online era of workshops. And I also mentioned before that we noticed from various parts of the world a really thirst for knowledge. So in particular, the questions, a lot of questions comes for the young people, the early career researchers, how they are called. And they are not simple questions, they are very nuanced ones. And it's kind of normal, right? It's there are many gray areas. There are also questions about which journal the people should trust, which journal the people should trust to publish, which journal the people should trust to read the papers. And we also provide guidance and education in that area. But despite the advantages of providing workshops for via Zoom, well, in the last year and a half we had no other option. I still recall the unique atmosphere of talking to people face to face, and I recall many editors and colleagues at Elsevier sharing again that unique perspective, that unique experience to get questions and to respond to people in place. Well, we wanted to make clear, we wanted to be very clear about our policies, and this is one aspect that you will hear a lot about that. So sometimes I understand thinking about journals, let's say high standard, or what they call prestige journals or glamour journals, that with a very clear and standard ethical requirements. In my, let's say, previous career, I used to publish a decent number of papers in the good journals, and I still remember, trying to meet all the requirements in the guide for authors of the journal. And I can understand the concerns of people nowadays trying to compete to get to publish to the prestige journals. But one positive aspect of these prestige journals is, as a particular case in the medicine, is that they bring in standards that become in time the gold standards. So that's the very good example is of the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, that, let's say, around 20 years ago, they brought in standards like patient consent or really transparent interest declarations, which nowadays are norms for many journals. Well, one particular aspect we've been very active at Elsevier, it's the increasing the transparency in declaring the competing interest. You may think that this is mainly for medical journals. However, we started introducing this for all our journals, all across all areas that we publish journals. And there are many examples that would support these initiatives. For example, papers in the humanities and social science, paper sponsored by a group that is a more conservative, more pro-traditional families, that might influence the type of research that is published in the humanity journal. Or more recently, papers published in the climate change area, or, for example, papers published that would compare the electric cars with more traditional cars. And if there is some commercial interest there, this might also influence the conclusions of the paper. So that's why we require the competing interest declarations from all authors for all our journals. Well, it's still not easy. It's a complex area as well. And if for people, for researchers in medicine, this is quite normal. For this is rather new for people in different areas, and the authors would need at the beginning a step-by-step guidance. And we have created actually that step-by-step guidance. So on the right-hand side, you can see the guidance for the authors, which is the author will encounter at every new submission in our editorial system. Another example of an initiative to increase the transparency is what is called credit. Actually, this is not Elsevier, this is a collaboration. And we could say it's a new standard for the authorship. the contribution of the authors, it's more transparent. So there's still the traditional, let's say, authorship would not disappear from the papers, but this credit section will be added to every paper. I'm thinking, for example, the papers with 3,000 or around 3,000 authors, let's say in the high energy particles physics. For example, if you are a researcher at CERN and you are one of the 3,000 authors, you might have a contribution to that paper that required, let's say, 1 year of your career. But if you are one of the 3,000, perhaps it will be difficult to notice your particular contribution. But credit helps those authors to get, let's say, more credit in the papers. We leave the editors of our journals to choose which possible contributions are set for by that journal, since contributions of authors could be different depending on the subject area, depending on the field. So contribution of an author in the, again, high energy particle physics would be different than a contribution of an author in medicine. So what's basically a credit about? So a corresponding author, upon submission in the editorial system, will see a list of 14 possible contributions of the co-authors to the paper. So the corresponding author only needs to tick the box where the contributions, where she knows that the co-authors contributed to that paper. As I said, not all of them are set by each journal, and it depends what the editors believe they are more likely to appear. Well, at the beginning, let's say in around 2015, some of our journals published by the Cell Press, they started introducing credit. And now we know that over 1,200 journals have included this credit in the initiative in the editorial systems. I would quickly mention two aspects about credit. We believe that it's fairer, and in the sense that, for example, depending on the subject area, first author and or the last author, it's by almost everyone knows that the role that they play in the research and in writing and submitting the paper. But how about the second, the third, or the fourth author? So I believe the credit is fairer for those authors. Another aspect we think credit helps is to decrease the number of authorship disputes. Well, in many cases, we kind of force the authors to talk to each other and to clarify their contributions to the paper. Of course, they should have done it earlier, but in many cases, it's good that they do it at this stage. So that's another contribution of credit to, prevent some of the ethics cases, in particular, the authorship disputes. Well, another type of AI help that we have implemented at Elsevier, in particular to help editors to find appropriate reviewers, is this review recommender, which is now available for the editors of each of our journals. So what it's important to mention here, so basically this introducing this tool has been triggered by the appearance of what we call a peer review manipulation. So very likely you are aware of those cases where authors, or more likely agencies, create email accounts, most of the time using the names of well-known people in the field. And those email accounts are suggested upon submission as reviewers. And up to a certain level, it's kind of understandable that the editors would submit the papers also to those author-suggested reviewers, given the fact that those email addresses do include names of real persons, of well-known researchers in the area. So we introduced this to help, again, the editors to choose the proper reviewer. You can notice that, for example, the tool would flag to the editor that the reviewer is an author-suggested one. And all the reviewer emails are validated by this tool against Scopus, and are also validated for their possible conflict of interest. But what is important to mention is that we keep advising editors to always use also at least one reviewer that has been not suggested by the author upon submission. And equally important, okay, the tool is very helpful. We got a very good feedback about this, but ultimately the decision it's to which reviewers will be invited is still with the editor of the journal. Perhaps the first AI-like tool that has been used at scale is the similarity check. It's been already for years. Also for years, every new submission to an Elsevier journal, it's automatically checked by the similarity check. It's again a very good tool, perhaps the most encountered, at least among the journals and the journal publishers. But it's still important to mention that ultimately there is a need for the human interpretation, for an expert interpretation. So it could appear there is still a high risk of false positives. And for example, if authors have already posted a preprint and they also submit a paper to a journal, similarity check will flag 99.5% similarity with text similarity with the preprint. So if the editor won't check which is that source of very large similarity index, that will reject the paper. And since Elsevier does not view the preprints as a previous publication, so that rejection will be basically with no reason. Unfortunately, and more recently, actually, we got also examples of false negatives, what we call disguised plagiarism. You may have heard recently published papers or preprints on tortured phrases. So people try to use reverse translation software or machines or techniques, and those will just the plagiarism will be disguised, will be not detected by similarity check. So it's my understanding that the Turnitin, the similarity check provider, it's already working on improving their tool to be able to detect this kind of disguised plagiarism as well. Well, I'm sure most of you people in the audience have heard of the paper mills. Well, again, I would mention Sonia's talk that she was talking about essays mills. So I'm here to talk about paper mills. Well, basically, personally, I'm not sure if they are fully automatically generated or people got for some results, but any paper with the same layout that seems to come from the same source. However, fairly often with only the different authors, different groups of researchers, in many cases, for example, could be from one big country. Well, we have been, since this appeared, we have been very active in trying to find solutions to timely detect the paper mills papers. So one option is, or one tool is that we are piloting at Elsevier, is to be able to detect duplicate publications. So before a paper is accepted and would appear online with a DOI, similarity check is not able to detect it. So that's why we are developing a tool that would be able to detect papers with basically the same content, but different authors, different affiliations that have been submitted either to the same journal or to different journals. There is also the standard, let's say, or more traditional duplicate submission or simultaneous submission. So authors that that actually submit the same paper, basically, so including the same authorship to two or more different journals. And as soon as one journal has accepted the paper, the authors contact the other journals asking their submissions to be withdrawn. But it very likely that that paper has already passed the peer review process. So the resources of the editors and the reviewers have been used, let's say. And also, if an author managed to publish basically the same paper more than once in the different journals, that would may affect, let's say, reviewer papers, or may kind of artificially improve, let's say, the CV of that person. Another initiative also aiming to detect the paper mill papers refers to the detection. We noticed that many papers coming from the paper mill papers do include images that have been inappropriately manipulated. And Elsevier has been active in searching and appropriate tool in the last 6 or 7 years, but only more recently, in the last couple of years, there are a few candidates, let's say, that seems to show the potential to be able to be used, sorry, at scale, to ideally be able to automatically detect issues with the images, more or less in the same way as the similarity check does with the text. So it's again an AI solution, and maybe already third time I have to mention that the tool seems to show a great potential and is very useful, but ultimately it will be the editor that will decide how and whether to use the results provided by the tool. The number of AI tools keeps increasing, and I will just mention two other tools like this. So one of them, StatCheck, is being used to check the issues or the errors in the statistics part of papers. The other one is called Penelope, and is basically used to automatically detect the ethics statements, whether the ethics statements in the paper have been appropriately included. Well, as I said earlier, it could happen that despite the education, the prevention, the detection at the early stage, we still receive many complaints about papers that have been already published. And the editors-in-chief of the journals would need to assess the complaint, would need to, and then to investigate and eventually to make a decision. So was very important. It is very important for us to provide the editors with all the resources that they need to investigate the ethics cases referring to the published papers. So that resources include a step-by-step advice on how to handle ethics cases. There are also clear policies and real life case studies. Some of the advice how to handle ethics cases, actually most of it has been created together with the COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics. Editors have also, and they are publicly available actually, form letters for various scenarios, form letters to contact the authors, to contact the institutions, contact the funding body. And a very useful section, I would say, is the detailed Q&A one for the not black and white cases. Well, even in this case, with a lot of support and flowcharts and guidance, at some point people can get stuck with the investigation. What would happen if, okay, the flowchart, the step-by-step advice will say, contact the institution, contact the authors, ask them to comment on the complaint. But the authors would not respond. The institution would not respond. What to do next? So this kind of cases at this stage, actually, the ethics team at Elsevier will get involved with providing advice. I have mentioned the Committee on Publication Ethics. All Elsevier journals are COPE members. I'm glad to mention that one of the Elsevier editors, Richard Horton, and over 20 years ago, was one of the from Lancet, was one of the editors that actually created COPE. Now nowadays I think they have more than 10,000 members. Very useful is on the COPE webpage the database of ethics cases that they provided advice on. Okay, the editors, let's say, have investigated, they have contacted the authors, asked them to comment on the allegation. They maybe contacted the institution, maybe they peer-reviewed again the paper, and now they are in the position to make a decision. They will need to decide whether the literature, the record, needs to be corrected or not. And it's been a lot of focus, and it's kind of understandable on retractions. What I would like to mention here is that the papers are retracted not only for serious ethical infringements, but papers are also retracted for what we call honest mistakes. So I recall Retraction Watch finding a few years ago that around 40% of the retractions have been actually done for errors, not for ethics issues. So I recall quite often authors proactively contacting the journals, claiming that or saying that post-publication they try to reproduce, for example, the results, and they were not able to do it. And depending on other evidence, the editors would be in the situation to retract the paper as the results were not reproducible. But there are also other ways to correct the literature. And well, it's the mistake is not so big, let's say, or the conclusions of the papers will still stand after correcting it. We can publish a corrigendum, but that for the corrigendum, all authors would need to agree with that. I noticed in the program of previous days, Miguel Roy from New York talking this time about self-plagiarism, but I recall his presentation at one of the previous World Conference on Research Integrities on a presentation of on expressions of concern. Elsevier journals have been quite active in recently with using and expressions of concern quite often. So it's an expression of concern is basically a warning to the readers. So usually they are used when there is enough evidence for the editor to be concerned of the paper, but there is not enough evidence to retract the paper. So the expression of concern can be published or used as a temporary solution, and sometimes it becomes a permanent solution. For example, if an institution would say, yes, I will investigate the case, but will take 1 year. So the editors publish an expression of concern just to warn the readers that there is an investigation done by the institution. But in many cases, the editors are not able to collect enough evidence to retract the paper or to leave it as it is. So the expression of concern became the permanent outcome. The retracted paper coming back online with the PDF file, every paper would be watermarked. For the sake of transparency, even though the paper was initially a subscription published in a subscription model. So basically the readers need to pay in order to read it. We make it after retraction, we make it freely available. Very rarely our journals also remove papers. So this time the PDF file of the paper would disappear, won't be available anymore. But they are very rare cases. So we published 2,700 journals, so we remove less than 10 papers in total per year. And they usually appear when there is a risk to the public health, or there is a patient privacy issue, when, for example, a patient that can be identified in the paper has not given the accept to, let's say, her photo to be included in the paper. So in this case, the PDF file of the paper is completely removed. And even more rarely, we replace a paper. I mean, the new version, let's say, of the paper would actually be the same with the previous one, but there is one small section, usually a photo, that, for example, the authors did not have the permission to use it. So that paper will be blacked out. That photo, sorry, will be blacked out. And the paper will still remain published. I kind of forgot to mention one important and useful guidance from COPE, from the Committee on Publication Ethics. So it's about the retraction guidelines. So many publishing houses have been active in drafting that retraction guidelines, but personally, as well as many of our editors, have provided a very positive feedback about the retraction guidelines. Well, I mentioned retraction and the fact that the retracted paper would be watermarked. It's our goal that the retractions to be fair, both to the authors as much as could be with the authors of retracted papers, but also for the readers. So the one reason why the papers are so clearly watermarked is that we wanted to make clear for the readers which papers have been already retracted and basically should not be used anymore. But also we want to make the retractions clear, accurate, timely, and also accessible. I mentioned already that all retracted papers are freely available. I know and complaints that the retraction or the investigations take longer and the retraction should be done quicker. But there are cases of very complex investigations are required, and of course that required time. Well, the retractions keep and catch a lot of attention. On the other hand, it should be mentioned that retractions are rather rare events. So 1 in 5,000 papers are actually retracted. And you can imagine if an editor will handle less than 5,000 papers, a retraction will be a very rare event for him, even though she is very experienced as an editor. So there are a lot of dilemmas and questions that usually appear, in particular for editors editors that are less experienced with retractions. So this is another situation, let's say, where we can help with the experience, since we are so big. We have a huge experience in retractions, so we can transfer, let's say, experience from one subject area, from one field to the other, and are there to support the editors in making the right decisions. Another, I would mention an interesting, let's say, dilemma that usually and more recently actually appeared, in particular since the paper mill case has came out. So in parallel with the paper mill papers, that the list of those papers are available online, there are a lot of cases when the authors proactively contacted the journals asking to their papers to be retracted, but providing a very vague and hard to believe reason. Like after a few years, the authors don't understand each other on the paper and they want to be retracted. So the question is, should the editor already retract the paper just to do it timely, to not leave the paper longer there, or should the editor investigate further, asking the authors for more details, for more reasons to retract the paper, even asking the authors to provide the raw data in some cases. And I'm not sure how I'm doing with regarding the time.
Несколько минут. Вы видите меня?
You have several minutes. You have several minutes.
Okay, so I'll
У вас есть 5-7 минут примерно.
You have about 5 minutes, 5-7 minutes.
Thank you. So it's actually the last part of my presentation, talking about a bit about reproducibility. Well, from Elsevier's perspective, is that in the last years we try to provide incentives to the authors to follow the good practice, to encourage them to share the data, to encourage them also to be transparent in the methods. And also we have been trying to evaluate the reproducibility during the peer review process. Statistics, the rigor in the statistics part of the papers. I would like to mention at the end a very a good example, a very simple change that we made. We just made it easily for the authors to share the data as part of the submission process. So we integrated the submission process. So we integrated into the submission process the sharing the data, but without making it mandatory for the authors. We just made it easier. So was less effort for the authors to share the data, and of course more convenient. And we saw the major increase in the level of data sharing from the moment of implementing this, just by making it easier for the authors. So this was from my side. I would like to thank you for attending this, and I'm looking forward for your questions. And I also stop sharing.
Спасибо за доклад.
Thank you very much, Mihail. There have been several questions from the listeners, but before forwarding them to you, I would like to make a very slight breach of ethics by using my moderator rights and ask you about translation, plagiarism, about duplicate publications and image search. The fact is, this has become the main focal point of our system, and we have worked with translation plagiarism for more than 5 years. We search for examples and do find them and work with them. And I think it might be interesting for you to look at our experience. When it comes to duplicate publications, in 2019, we found in the Russian database more than 70,000 cases of duplicate publications across 147,000 papers. This was impressive. Some papers were duplicated dozens of times. It sounds like science fiction, but it was real. And now we have prepared a paper with the results of this study. It is now on peer review in one of the Elsevier journals, and I hope it will be published soon. But this was only happening in Russia. This was only detected in Russia, and I think you might be interested in these results, and I can privately share this data with you, and part of this data has already been presented at conferences. When it comes to image search, I talked about this on the first day of the conference. Our first announcement came. We made an industry-grade solution that can find duplicate images across papers, not just direct duplicates of the same images, but also slightly edited, like scaled down, changed quality, rotated, and other image manipulation. This works, this has proven efficient, and we are planning to implement it across our system next January. And I think it might be of interest for your publishing house. I would be happy to collaborate because the results are shocking, to be fair. I cannot give you a full list of our results, but I can later on send you several slides from my presentation. It looks stupendous. That's that. And now to questions from the audience. There are quite a lot of them. A question from Anna Abalkina, Free University of Berlin. The question is, this year, many cases were registered when content was indexed from hijacked journals in Scopus. Why could not Scopus prevent this? Why doesn't it remove illegitimately indexed content from, for example, 2013, although Scopus knows that it was a hijacked journal? There are several more examples, for example, Design Engineering journal. Could you comment on this?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you, Anna. And although I'm not working or involved in this, or Scopus, it's perceived or should be considered as independent. I heard about the case. So what I could comment is that Scopus used to have a clear criteria for indexing journals. And they are, since this and the other few cases appeared, they are working on improving and updating the criteria. So more about that, I would suggest where I can facilitate Anna's contact with my colleagues at Scopus. But I know that it's been a big issue. But I have to admit I haven't been involved very deeply in this. But if there is interest, I can facilitate the contact with my colleagues at Scopus.
We will then try and forward the question as Anna has posted it to you so that no information is lost, and we will forward all the questions to you later on. Now, another comment from me, if it's possible to discuss it. When we talked to our colleagues from the Russian branch of Elsevier several years ago, the colleagues said that there is an issue of removing from index some material that was indexed long ago, several years ago, because this will influence a whole set of metrics and indicators. Do you know whether anything has changed in this aspect, or is this outside of your work?
Well, if it's again about Scopus, I'm afraid, and I feel sorry to not being able to give too many details, as I have been just not involved in that. What I would be kind of looking forward as well at Scopus will be that they should, as soon as, let's say, inappropriate citations are found by particular papers, the age index and the to be updated, the age index of the citation score of the authors to be updated. And to my knowledge, for the time being, this doesn't happen. So once again, I'm sorry I cannot provide more details as I haven't been involved in this. But I can follow up online, offline, sorry, and again with my colleagues at Scopus and just come back with an answer, a more detailed one.
Thank you. One more question. How do you incentivize the editor? How do you motivate them not just to use the AI or other technology when they're checking a paper? Are there any ways to encourage them, to motivate them not to rely on AI exclusively?
Well, basically, the AI tools have been introduced in the last few years, perhaps except Similarity check, which is a bit older. And I have to say that there are rare cases where the editors count exclusively on the AI tools. So I would say it's hardly need for a special incentives for that. I know there are cases when, for example, a paper is rejected because 100% similarity text with a preprint of the same authors. But when they start their role as editors, it is being made clear to them that ultimately the decision it's with them rather than with the tools.
Ну, вот упомянутый вами пример.
The case that you mentioned about this preprint, this was not a breach of ethics on behalf of the authors. This is a common practice when an author makes a preprint publicly available and then submits the draft paper to the journal. And from my experience, there are different policies in journals concerning these preprints. Some journals say that preprints are okay and they consider this for publication. Others say that if there is a preprint, they would never look at this paper. They just look at the percentage of similarities and then they don't look further if this is too high. Does Elsevier has an overarching policy on this or some guidelines on preprints?
Elsevier's policy is that the preprints, of course, if they are of the same authors as the submission to the journal, would be not viewed as a previous publication. So if an author has posted a preprint and then submitted the paper, the journal would handle the paper as a new submission. Referring back to the unpleasant experience of paper retracted because of text similarity with the preprint, we have been working with the provider of the similarity check, the tool that we use to detect the text similarity, to make the preprints, to label them clearly in the tool which papers are preprints and which sources are preprints. And now recently, or there will be soon, they will come back with a clearer label of each source, each text source, including the preprints. So the editors would be able to easily see that the source is a preprint and should not be viewed as a previous publication. And I have to mention also that there are some society journals and also Lancet and Cell Press journals that have a different policy regarding the preprints. But what I'm talking about here is that the journals at the Science, Technology and Medical group, the 2,700 journals that do not view the preprints as previous publication.
Понятно. То есть рекомендация.
That's clear. So there is a kind of a guideline for authors to look at the publishers and the journal's policy before they make the decision on submitting the paper or placing a preprint. So you can select a journal whose policy corresponds to your practice if the preprint has been published. And now the next question. Could you inform us as to the algorithm of actions if the author by themselves finds out that an earlier publication of their own was plagiarized by somebody else? If it's the author who finds plagiarism in somebody else's work, what should the author do?
Well, the author should contact the journal that allegedly published the plagiarizing paper. So if there is an Elsevier journal, that journal will investigate the complaint. And as any other plagiarism allegation. So it's quite common. We receive this kind of complaints. So authors just noticing, that their own paper has been plagiarized by others. And if let's say the second paper, the later paper has been published by an Elsevier journal, we will investigate it as any other complaint of plagiarism. So just flag it to the journal. That's the advice for the authors.
Спасибо.
Thank you. The next question, possibly asked by a student. It is hard to follow all the requirements of a Scopus indexed journal if one is a student. It's hard for them to follow all these requirements. What do you think? How can this problem be solved?
I would imagine the question refers to somebody that wants to index a journal. And I am again in the unpleasant situation to not be able to help much, as I'm not familiar in detail with the...
Excuse me? I think they're talking more not about indexing, but about the fact that indexed journals that are in the leading databases have very high standards, detailed requirements for draft papers and their results. That's a question to you as an experienced
I see what you mean. Sorry for misinterpreting.
What's the best guidance to get into these journals?
Well, I agree that the guide for authors keep adding or updating requirements for the authors. But on the other hand, these requirements are basically to make sure that together with the processing the paper after the acceptance, the paper will be properly published and would avoid any issues with any ethics issues. On the other hand, I know that many journals accept the submissions in what is called your paper, your way. I mean, with not so many formatting requirements, just a Word file with figures included, and that's all. So the author might try to look at the guide for authors of the journal and see whether the journal accept the submissions in this, again, what is called your paper, your way, with less requirements.
It means that in principle, your recommendation for authors is similar. If the author does not fall into one journal's requirements, they should try to look for other journals in the same area, and possibly they would be able to find a journal to whose requirements the paper would correspond.
Well, I would add to them, most of the STM journals, Elsevier journal, they have basically the same requirements. And if there is an author that really struggling with submitting a paper, the advice would be also, and the author wants to submit it to a particular journal, the author can just contact the journal and flag which are the issues with the submission. Sometimes, rather rarely, but I recall cases when the authors, for example, converting to the PDF as the last part of the submission process didn't work for some reason. And the potential possible authors, they just contacted the journals, and the journal was able to help the author. So it not always is needed that the author will look for another journal. And if there are issues with the submission to a journal that the author wants to submit, just contact the journal via email, or I think any journal webpage has the option for the authors or anybody to contact the journal and ask for help.
Спасибо, Михаил.
Thank you, Mihail.
And if I
Your
may,
presentation was
sorry,
very
one
interesting.
quick add.
Да-да.
Usually, or at least my perception is that the early career researchers, they publish together with the more experienced authors, with at least one senior head of the group author. So I wonder if, or I would expect the more senior author to have more experience with the submission.
Да,
Yes, that's a true comment. I agree with you. So thank you for your presentation, for your detailed answers to our questions. I'm remembering fondly your past visit to Moscow 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the pandemic has separated us, and now this is the only way for us to interact. But I do hope that the situation will change soon and we'll be able to meet face to face. But now we continue our interaction like this, which is still a positive factor. Thank you very much.
One quick mention. I'm really sorry that I missed your presentation about image manipulation and then translation plagiarism, but I would be very interested to keep in touch offline to learn actually more about the updates on your tools.
Спасибо, Михаил.
Thank you, Mihail. I will write to you personally with more details, and I think I will be able to add even more information than I had in my presentation. I've got things to share.
Okay,
Let
thank
us
you, and
stay in
thank you
touch and interact.
for invitation to present at this conference.
Спасибо вам.
Thank you very much.